addiction is a disease or a disorder of mind, body, and soul. So it does have a physiological aspect like diabetes.
Sure.
It really does. It's more than that. Sobriety is synonymous with the word freedom. Addiction is a form of slavery. The desperation of addiction is what really brought me to an end of myself. Vietnam veteran, he didn't have much material wealth, but he was happy.
Today is going to be a really powerful episode, I believe, but I'm a little biased, so that could be. But we have Mike Kuklica, who is one of our licensed therapists in our intensive outpatient substance use disorder program, and we're going to talk a lot about addiction, the benefits and impact of AA and spirituality, and just looking at addiction recovery in a more holistic, full approach. We touch on a lot of different things in this episode, and I think you're going to be really pleased and excited to be a part of this discussion. Enjoy. Thank you.
But I'll tell you where my passion comes from. My parents were young when they had me. My dad, he was a social worker for 30 years at the state mental hospital up in Cambridge.
Wow.
My mother was a school nurse, and so they came from the helping fields. There is alcoholism in my family, not in my immediate household.
Right.
Growing up, I did get exposure to that, the alcoholism. I started drinking at a young age, and then eventually, to make a long story short, started using different drugs in high school, dropped out of cross country and track, went to college, and I got severely addicted to opiates and benzos and pills and alcohol and a lot of other drugs. And I get married, and around the age 25, my wife became pregnant. She was able to stop, and I wasn't. And it got to the place where, it was it was a life or death situation. And my sister came home, and she and I are very different. She was valedictorian of her college, and I became a gutter drug addict, really. And but she was the only one that was able to talk to me. She saw me walking along a road, told me to get into the car. She was the only one that was able to really persuade me to go get the help I needed at the time.
Right.
And I think it was providential for sure, the timing of it. And I ended up surrendering to help at the time, going to the hospital. I ended up going to a rehab in Columbus, and I stayed with my sister as well. Eventually I met who became my sponsor, and he was a Vietnam veteran. He didn't have much material wealth, but he was happy, and he was sober. And I could just tell this, he was real, and he had what I was looking for, that serenity, that joy, despite his pain in his legs constantly, and his
despite any difficulties he's having, and he's figured out a way to
transcend,
right.
And I asked him to be my sponsor, and I was unemployed at the time, so I spent a lot of time with him.
Right.
And he walked me through the steps. I began to see that sobriety is synonymous with the word freedom. Addiction is a form of slavery. It was, the way I was living, I needed the drugs like I needed water. And that's one way I describe addiction. The desperation of addiction is what really brought me to an end of myself. I had gone to social workers, I had gone to counselors, I had gone to psychiatrists, I had gone to a psychologist at one point. None of these people were able to help me. They had all the fancy degrees, they had all the training and everything. None of them were able to help me. And this man who had no college degree, but he had a lifetime of experience, was able to help me where other people could not. And I'm not disparaging the professionals at all. I mean, in some way, shape, or form, they did play some sort of a role.
Right. They're part of your journey.
But they didn't really have the means to be able to help me. And I needed to, number one, when I started reading in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous, it described addiction as being a soul sickness and a spiritual malady. Although there are there's a biological component for sure. There are emotional aspects. There's physiology. Addiction is a disease or a disorder of mind, body, and soul. So it's more, it does have a physiological aspect like diabetes.
Sure.
It really does. But it's more than that. And so the solution has to be a more integrated, almost like, Eastern medicine has a more holistic, integrative approach than Western medicine. Western medicine tends to focus more on the material aspect and the physiological, and we've done very well with that over here.
Or we become really siloed in terms of, okay, all it takes is a medication, or all it takes is this piece. So you're talking, because addiction affects so much of who you are, right? Mind, body, and soul, right? You have to have an intervention approach that addresses mind, body, and soul, right? There is a model towards addiction recovery that I like to use. It's called the biopsychosocial spiritual model. So, and a lot of people refer to the biopsychosocial, but then you add the spiritual piece, which I think is interesting. And so, and I've come to believe it's necessary. From what I've seen, where I've seen the most effective results in treating addiction. If we rule that part out and we don't include that, we're achieving limited results, for sure. So what is the spirituality? What do you think is like the spiritual aspect of the mind, or the biopsychosocial, adds what element to a person's recovery that you find to be crucial?
Well, it's the liberating aspect of it. It's when you're living in addiction and you come to that, the people I work with, they come to the office and they're experiencing an existential crisis of some sort, whether it be legal, physical, and they've tried this, that, and the other. They've tried doing it themselves. And, we live in a culture that almost encourages self-centeredness, and the addiction, you're living in survival mode anyway, and you're living in a very desperate way. You have to find some sort of self-transcendence, some sort of surrender of self, because you come to that end of self where you can't do that anymore.
So what might that look like? Someone comes in, we're asking them to kind of surrender themselves in kind of the way that you're talking. So what might that look like?
We can use the 12-step model that was discovered by AA. We can use that in treatment and introduce people to these principles that were discovered back in the 1930s that they discovered helped alcoholics achieve sobriety. Let me do just a short history on this. In the 1930s, there was a man named Bill Wilson who was an end-stage alcoholic. He ended up in the hospital several times, and his final stay at the hospital, at Towns Hospital, there was a man named Dr. Silkworth. He was a medical doctor that worked mostly with alcoholics in New York. And Bill had an experience in the hospital where a light, he describes it being a light filled the room, and then when the light went away, his desire to drink was gone. Okay, so he described what a spiritual experience. He didn't quite understand it. He shared it with the doctor. The doctor said that he was a scientific man, paraphrase, and that he doesn't pretend to understand what happened, but he noticed a peace about him. And there's another doctor that described what recovery looks like. Look for a profound change of personality in the individual. Bill began trying to help other drunks for like the next 6 months. He had this desire to help other drunks get sober. And so here's a man who was living a very self-centered life, and now all of a sudden he's practicing altruism, And so he goes on a business trip to Akron. The business aspect falls through, and he reaches out to clergy for them to help him find an alcoholic to talk to, And this Episcopal priest puts him in touch with Henrietta Seiberling, who was a part of this Oxford group, and she knew Dr. Bob, who was an alcoholic, an old family friend, and she put them together, and that is the first. That was the first.
That's the first AA group,
right? AA meeting that ever happened, and but what they did is, through trial and error, these are people that are just trying to survive. Okay, so they reached out to the medical, they reached out to clergy, they reached out to all kinds of people, and they kept what worked and they discarded what didn't work.
Right.
There was also contributions from the world of psychology to the 12 steps as well. Before AA was founded, there was a man named Roland Hazard who went to Europe, and he was a severe alcoholic, and he was having sessions with Dr. Carl Jung. He made a lot of progress, but nevertheless, he ended up drunk again, and he went back to the doctor, and Dr. Carl Jung told him, that he has been limited in helping alcoholics of this man's extent, and basically Roland Hazard asked him, is there no hope? And Dr. Carl Jung admitted, he said that he knew of occurrences, historical, that people have experienced religious conversions that have changed them and helped them to find sobriety. And Dr. Carl Jung called it a vital spiritual experience that was essential. And this is coming from a scientific man, a psychologist. That was a contribution Carl Jung made, that he told Roland that that's what he needed in order to get better. So Roland came back to the United States, and he started attending the Oxford groups. Bill Wilson was also influenced by a psychologist named William James, who wrote a book. It's a psychology of religion book called The Varieties of Religious Experience. They took everything that they learned. They got help from the medical community, religious community. They were not trying to found a new religion at all. It was not they were just trying to figure out what worked.
What's going to help?
Yeah.
But you're bringing up kind of spirituality, but I also hear you also saying that it's taking things from different entities or modalities or approaches and taking the best of each that fits with. So there's the spirituality component, there's the bio component, there's the psychosocial component. That it's interesting because, like, I think what I see happen in today's society is we're so siloed.
Yes. That
it's one without anything else. Like I'm only going to do this, or I'm only going to do this. But what would happen if we?
Right.
And I think that's kind of, you found healing in AA and those approaches, but you're also bringing those tenets to actual psychological treatment, counseling, aspects of it. You're incorporating multiple pieces to the puzzle.
Yeah, there's other contributions to the field. That was sort of the beginning of recognizing that addicts and alcoholics are patients. And Dr. Silkworth was really a trailblazer in that.
Right.
Eventually Dr. Bob partnered with Sister Ignatia up in Akron, and they started a detox unit that's still there today. A lot of times addiction was looked at in moral terms and in a criminal justice way, and there are those aspects. There are still today. There are moral implications, for sure, and that's why
the problems people cause are not the cause of their problems.
Right.
So they're causing moral implication issues, but that's not the cause of.
That's right.
Their issue. The cause isn't because they are trying to be bad people, or wanting to be bad people. They are doing things that makes people react that way. Right. But it's not the cause of why they're struggling. That's right.
And it is a good sign once a person gets abstinent. Abstinence is a precondition to sobriety. It's necessary. If they have some guilt over the things that they've done in the past. And so the 12 steps provides a means of resolving that guilt for the ways in which
make amends, things like that.
Exactly. The ways in which they've harmed others, harmed themselves, that has to be addressed for them to live a happy life sober. And so it's a good sign if someone has guilt and remorse for the pain they've caused others. You know?
And so, difference between guilt and shame. Guilt is I did something wrong and I need to make that right. Versus I'm a horrible person because I did something bad.
Right. And if it is truly a criminality problem, you know, sociopaths don't experience guilt and remorse.
Right. So that's a good sign, right?
Exactly.
I would worry if you didn't feel bad. Right.
And even though they were living that addiction life and desperate to, in the things that addicts do to obtain the drugs, oftentimes is immoral.
Well,
right.
And so let me ask you, the devil's advocate or a side that tends to perpetuate that negative stigma would be, well, you know, if they really felt guilty, they would have stopped. They would have stopped hurting other people. If they really cared about this person, you know, they would have made the choice to get help and to stop. And, you know, so when we see people repeatedly do something that offends others, it's hard for people to see that as anything other than they're morally corrupt or wrong. But that's well, for me, that's not a really helpful way to look at people, because it's only tends to perpetuate that behavior. It's like that self-fulfilling prophecy. If you give a dog a name, they're eventually going to respond to it. And, you know, if we react to people that are struggling in that kind of way, then, you know, we're going to give that person a name and then they become that name. Right.
Now, and at the same time, we're not excusing bad behavior, but we're recognizing what's going on here. Why are they having that behavior? It's that desperate need to feed the addiction and to find the drugs. The person that robs the Circle K, and they put the picture on the front page, you know, but there's a story behind that.
There's context.
Exactly. You need to realize we're dealing with a sick individual, you know. And so moral implications, yes, but the disorder's not in and of itself immoral.
Right.
So making that distinction is very helpful, especially in the treatment context. I found that recognizing, and I get this from you know, the teaching of you know, the Catholic religion. We recognize the inherent dignity of every human being, and all human life is sacred from the womb to the tomb, you know, regardless. And there is hope for everybody, you know, and when we can look at the patients we're working with in a compassionate manner, putting judgment aside, not that we still have to make judgments as counselors, you know, as far as we still need to think and exercise prudence.
Sure. Right? Decision making and you know, but it also comes from a place of assessing the issue and figuring out what's going to be. And I think working towards, it's not judgment in a reactive way, like, oh, you offended me, you're you know, this awful person. It's
not at all.
I'm noticing that these are your needs, and I got to make a decision to help you, meet those needs.
And sometimes I've found that you know, reality therapy can be very helpful. The motivational interviewing model, find that framework very helpful in working with addicts as well. I know CBT's been a big model in the addiction.
But when you talk reality therapy, you talk motivational interviewing, you're talking, I think the way I like to look at those is finding those small kernels of desire to change and going down that road with them, like helping them process that out so that we can, you know, versus you better change because if you don't, these bad things are going to happen, because that often doesn't work the way you hope.
It doesn't. Not with the people I've worked with.
Right.
So, it didn't work with me.
Sure.
That approach. So
I'm curious as to, is there elements of AA that recognizes the power of connectedness, like the ability to feel like, because I would imagine, and maybe as somebody suffering from addiction, that because of the guilt that's probably almost, at least for a period of time, experienced as shame, I have a trouble feeling like I can fit in with somebody that doesn't struggle with addiction. So for me to find healing, I think there's elements of, number one, if I'm with people that are in recovery, I am around hope.
Yes.
Because, it's much more hopeful to see somebody that's been through addiction and get past it than to hear somebody tell them, oh, there's hope out there, and they've never experienced that. So it's hard for our brain to kind of trust that. Whereas if I go to AA, where there's the power of group, and I think one of the things that I appreciate about AA is, if it's peer run, effectively, that there's that element of where group is used for good.
And it has its own framework that protects the fellowship.
Right.
Yeah. And so the social connectedness is critical. The addiction is a very isolating disorder, and even when an addict has many friends, so to speak, in that world, it's still an isolating disorder. And so getting connected with healthier people, getting connected especially with people that have been where they are and are on the path to wellness themselves, it's easy for the person suffering from addiction to identify and relate to someone who has been there, just like veterans, that have been in wars. They might not have known each other in the war, but over here they meet each other and they automatically have that connection.
Brotherhood connect,
right. And so there's value in that. But also eventually, it's good for the person in recovery to venture out from that as well. And, and
in what way?
Not just stay cocooned
in
the recovery meetings. There may be a period of time where that's necessary.
Right. If I was struggling with an addiction and I just went to a therapist that didn't have addiction in their past, doesn't necessarily mean that they can't be helpful to me.
Not at all.
But I do need connection with people that have struggled like me. Right.
That's right.
Like that doesn't mean that I abandon that piece.
Right.
But that I fill those gaps in other ways. And I think oftentimes that's not what happens. Sometimes that can not happen, where it's like, okay, I only go, like you say, to that cocoon.
That's right.
Because there's a sense of safety. And even though the world's not made up of only this cocoon.
Right.
And I will have to navigate environments where that cocoon's not there.
That's right.
So I should have experience with people that don't have that same experience, so I can learn how to live in any environment, right? That's
right. That's part of growth in recovery as well. If a person's a diabetic, it's not necessary for their doctor to also be a diabetic in order to help them.
Sure.
Right? And so that's true, but it's also very helpful in that sense for a diabetic to talk with a fellow sufferer.
Sure.
Right?
Right. Relatability, feeling like you're not alone, normalization.
Right.
I know when we do trauma work, a lot of times we do, at least in the trauma work I've done, is you do it in a group. Because it helps normalize that, hey, what I'm experiencing doesn't make me crazy. It makes me normal.
Right.
Given the circumstances that I've experienced.
Right.
With a diabetic, there are certain things that might contribute to them being a diabetic that they need help with, that, like going to a nutritionist might not be as effective as who also struggles with eating healthy, and what do they do and how do they deal with it, and do they have those same experiences?
That's right.
So
I'm glad you brought up trauma, because there is a trauma aspect with addiction as well, and you have a lot of experience in that area with treatment. There's a doctor up in Canada that has done a lot with the trauma aspect with addiction and
specifically
that relationship, and he brings a lot of insight, and I think there is a there is a connection there. A lot of the drugs are painkillers, including alcohol. It's not a good painkiller, but Cocaine really it has a numbing effect.
Sure.
It's a painkiller, and so the trauma, the suffering, the drugs provide temporary relief.
Sure.
And then eventually it can, if the biochemistry isn't already set up for addiction in the individual,
Right.
it can eventually change that biochemistry in the person's physiology to where they do become addicted to the drug that's giving them relief from the emotional pain, trauma,
Right.
suffering.
Sometimes I worry about kind of the way we communicate about addiction in a sense of like, oh, you just have the gene and that's why you're this way. So you took the drug and now you're this alcoholic or drug addict or whatever, and not. But I think if you look closer, or if you're talking to people, and I'm sure the things that you learn in the treatment or in AA meetings, they're not talking about how great their life is. You know, there's something missing or something lost, or there is a trauma, or you know, think about painkillers, you know, like athletes, you know, injuring and it affecting their career. And, you know, that takes a toll on you, you know, so there's being able to kind of not try to separate everything, but understand that addiction is complex.
Yes.
There's lots of things that are contributing to it, and it's not just one thing.
That's right.
It's not just, oh, I have an addiction gene, you know. And I think sometimes in trying to understand things, we try to drill it down into one solution, and I think that's dangerous because it affects the way we look at things, and then in terms of how we treat it.
And addiction's very complex. However, I found that the solution is simple.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and the key to recovery is trying to help individuals and treating them as individuals to find the simple solutions that work for them. Mm-hmm. Right, and the other aspect, from my experience, the suffering that I went through and that brought me to an end of myself brought me to a point of, you know, surrendering to my maker. It brought me to my present faith and belief in God. And I'd like to talk about Viktor Frankl real quick. You know, he was a psychiatrist that was in the concentration camps in Nazi Germany.
In Search of Meaning, I believe is his book, right?
Right. Mm-hmm. And he brings a contribution to addiction treatment in the fact that how do we find meaning in the suffering? Mm-hmm. How do we transcend the self, you know, aligning ourselves with higher truths and absolutes in life. Mm-hmm. And I find that the addicts that I work with are hungry for, you know, higher meaning and values and something foundational to build their lives on, you know, and that helps them to transcend their situation, get in touch and encounter truth that is bigger than themselves. You know, we live in a world of relativism. We've had the me generation. We've had do your own thing, and that all those philosophies for the addict don't go well. That does not. And I would venture to say there are many other addictions besides drugs and alcohol. Sure. And what contributes to the stigmatization is the oftentimes immoral and criminal behavior associated with addiction.
How it affects people around us.
And the illegality of the drugs as well. But there's addiction to food, to politics, to power, to money, to pornography.
Right.
There's so many other addictions. You know, I mean, the list can go on. People that are addicted to the illegal drugs, you know, they experience more of a stigma more so than a lot of these other people that experience the other addictions. Internet addiction. Sure. Social media addiction.
Well, right? and escape and kind of, I almost look at mental health or addiction, but mental health from a perspective of not all these disorders in the DSM, but in terms of our ability to tolerate difficult emotions, difficult experiences. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, if our ability to tolerate that is really low, Like it overwhelms us to feel pain. So your comment about finding meaning in the suffering makes kind of goes in line with my thought of that pain is information. Certainly the sensations we experience in our body don't feel good, but the pain is telling us something.
That's right.
If I have pain in my knee, there's an injury there that I have to work on, or I have to give it rest, or it's my body telling me, go sit on the couch for a second, like to help it heal. Same thing with, loneliness is telling me that, I need to find connection somewhere or reach out, or, grief is related to, a mourning thing that I need to do. It's giving us information that I think people have to not be afraid of the pain, find meaning, find purpose, find value in it, and not feel so hopeless around it.
Right.
And I think what you're talking about is, we can succumb to that negative experience and look for that way to get rid of what it makes us feel in our body. So if I seek out porn, it's an escape. If I use a drug, if I eat, those are stimulating the reward networks in our brain and makes us not think about the pain.
Right.
And so even taking medication, I don't want to feel the pain. And that's my fear about medication, any type of medication, whether it's medication assisted treatment in terms of addiction or mental health medication, is I'm not allowing myself to feel.
Right.
And then that doesn't make me whole, right? Or holistic, that holistic approach. That doesn't make me full, And so we shouldn't be, I think with addiction, it's coming to terms with that, right? That I got to learn how to find purpose and meaning in that, as well as finding purpose in life in that existential piece.
Yeah, that's right.
I said a lot.
Sorry. No, that's okay. There's a very powerful quote that Father Joseph Martin, he did a lot to help alcoholics over the years. And he says, pain is the fertilizer for spiritual growth. And I think that a lot of what we need to do to help patients that suffer from addiction is to help them find ways of that are more constructive and meaningful in dealing with the pain of life. If someone has used opiates for 20 years, as a means of trying to cope with that pain, then it's going to take it's going to take some time to learn how to deal with that pain in a more constructive, life-affirming way. That's one of the challenges, and that's one of the things that needs to happen.
Right. Where do you see traditional treatment approaches, or if outside of AA, how do you see your role as you're a therapist at our agency, and you provide clinical treatment?
That's right.
I mean, even though you incorporate those tenets, it's a little different. I mean, there's elements of similarity, but then there's how do you see it, or how do you put the puzzle together?
What helps me the best is, I'll go back to the biopsychosocial spiritual model, right? That's the kind of the umbrella, the framework that I can work with. And I draw from different disciplines that I've noticed. It's using prudence with the individual. I don't look at categories. I don't look at, I don't believe that we should apply the Henry Ford assembly line model to therapy.
Sure, cookie cutter approach.
And so you have to take into consideration the person's history, and assess everything. What family history, current family situation, legal, social, religious background, everything needs to be, and then getting to know the person as an individual, not just the assessment, but getting to know them
what's
in a real way.
What's going to impact their treatment? Their experience is going to play a huge role in how they engage in treatment. And
then taking into consideration their personality and the things they're currently dealing with, and then using prudence in order to best help this individual.
Sure.
And it becomes a bit more complex in a group setting.
Mm-hmm.
But I try to provide the most conducive environment, a safe place for people to attend, and it's an artistry. It's a learning experience for sure. It's an ongoing learning experience. I got to recognize, okay, we have a group, but this is a group of individuals. It's been working well so far. I mean, I've done this for a while, and there's always more to learn, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, so, and I find it fascinating in terms of the group, because in like an intensive outpatient program, you have people of varying degrees of recovery.
Yes.
Some are active in their addiction. Some have been just starting to make progress. Some are really far along.
That's right.
And there's those dynamics that I think are really interesting in terms of how people enter into it, how the group's functioning already to be able to help that person coming in feel safe.
That's right.
Do you think of a certain characteristic of the group or a certain thing that helps what you described, that safety, that allow for all those individual personalities to find healing, even though there might be differences among each of them in their experience and their journey?
I try to facilitate a very hospitable, welcoming environment.
So acceptance,
encouragement,
mm-hmm.
An attitude of encouragement in everybody in the group. Help facilitating the group members to get to know one another. Facilitating those kind of discussions, building that rapport among the members
mm-hmm.
is crucial.
Relational connection.
Mm-hmm. That is absolutely crucial. And if they decide to attend meetings outside of group, that's even better.
Right.
At that point. So
no, I think that's a powerful thing. If you're coming in and feel accepted or welcomed, and no one's
that's right.
shutting the door on you or saying, no, you don't deserve to be here or whatever. We take people in to the group, at varying degrees of contemplation or engagement.
No one's in a position to be judgmental of anybody in this group, and I try to facilitate that kind of mindset, that attitude.
Sure.
It's we're all here for a common purpose. I want to provide a very non-judgmental
mm-hmm.
environment.
Right.
No matter where the person has been. And it's not hard to achieve that, honestly.
Right. When you have a lot of people that,
right,
it's kind of hard for them to be judgmental when the mirror can be put right back up. And so they can relate to, I don't want to be judged. So,
right. I mean, we bring moral psychology into it because it needs to be. There's a moral aspect of man, but it's done in a non-judgmental manner.
Mm-hmm.
So we introduce certain values, absolutes, principles to live by that work.
Right.
But these are introduced to the group in a very non-judgmental way,
mm-hmm.
and that's crucial. So it's needed, but it depends on how it's presented.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Sure.
Whether the person's going to respond to it, and people really are hungry for that.
Right. The thought that's running through my brain in terms of how we've talked about what is helpful for people struggling with addiction and the connection they find in AA and the hope and things like that. But the one piece that we haven't really talked about but is hugely affected by people struggling with addiction is family.
Yes.
And so I think that's a whole box to open and dive into. We can talk about it for a really long time, but I'm curious as people are going into treatment, engaging in treatment. Now, they might have a long track record of family encouraging or shaming into getting into treatment, or families are struggling because they don't know what to do or how to do, or maybe they're even trying to change them. What do you see as the role of family, or how do you see family playing a role or playing a part in the person's recovery? Because I think sometimes if you're talking about the moral implications of people struggling with addiction, that takes a toll on family. So how can family be a part of this journey in a way that's going to be helpful or successful. And I probably...
You are right. That's a very big topic. However, the family, addiction affects everybody in the family unit. Tell this a specific case. Example, this woman came into IOP twice, had tried inpatient treatment, a number of things, and finally we did family intervention work. Her parents had custody of her children, and it wasn't until we started working with the entire family that she
made progress,
got well, and now she's working in the field.
Right.
So in her situation, it was absolutely essential to work with the family. Family members oftentimes try to help or manage the situation in maladaptive ways that tend to further the problem oftentimes. And
from good intentions, right? I mean, they're trying to, but then find a path that's not.
Often from good intentions. And here's the thing, addicts or any human being often doesn't respond well to someone trying to manage their lives for them. Right. And that's where the
family,
where the criminal justice system sometimes has fallen short. And there's even therapists that approach clients in that manner. And, I haven't seen that approach usually get lasting results. I realize that I've learned that once a person suffering from addiction achieves physical abstinence for a period of time, now they have the capacity to make a decision for themselves. And that's what needs to happen, whether they're court referred, whether the family's pressuring them or whatever. They need to come to a place where they make a decision. And I have to respect that. As a therapist, I can't make somebody make that decision for themselves. And when they decide, then that's when recovery really
and that's
begins.
That's probably the hardest thing to ask of anyone, right? Is you can't, you have to step back and say,
right,
I'm not going to be able, I need you to kind of come to that conclusion. I can't get you there.
Right.
Because the more I push, the more I get pushed back, right? And
I can walk beside them. There's a lot that I can do as a therapist. There's a lot that families can do. And that's a whole nother topic.
Yeah.
But eventually, if there's going to be lasting recovery, we have to respect that the individual eventually does have to make a decision that for themselves. And when they get to that point, when they find that self-worth finally, are able to come to that conclusion and put it into action, that's when you see lasting recovery.
Sure.
I'll tell another real quick story to illustrate. A few years back, an alcoholic was referred to me by a doctor. He had pancreatitis. He ended up in the emergency room, and he was in bad shape physically. He was in his 30s. He had liver problems, pancreatitis. His body was becoming diabetic, all because of his drinking. And so, existential crisis, right? He comes to my office, and he knows it's life or death. But does he really want to stop drinking at that point? No, the desire to drink is still there. He came out of necessity, out of desperation. And he came, and it wasn't until like 3 or 4 months later did he finally make a decision that he wanted sobriety for himself.
Sure.
Right? And so it was a process. As a therapist, I walked with him and instructed him and, worked with him up until the point where, okay, now he wants it.
Right.
Right? And so, he's sober today, 7 years later.
Right. I always kind of laugh because we would do in residential with teens, we would run a drug and alcohol group, and they would get referred. They were never going, hey, I want to come,
Right.
and so they would get referred. Of course, they would have to go, and the first thing even before saying hi, they're like, hey, I'm not an addict, or I'm not.
Right.
They're trying to convince me. It's like, okay, let's just let's talk about it. But the fault would be, or the error in my ways would be like, well, yes, you are. or, you know, like I've got to convince you that you're in need of help.
Right.
But anytime I've seen somebody do that, it just pushes them further into their addiction, and it makes them not feel safe in the circles where they can get help.
That's right.
And so that always kind of, that story, it's like, I'm going to be with you. I'm going to walk parallel with you, and I'll be there, you know, through this journey.
Right.
But I'm not trying to make that journey happen faster than it can. I can't rush you to keep with my pace.
Right.
I have to keep with your pace, but be there, and then keep maybe throwing up that mirror to hopefully, you know, let their brain kind of come to that conclusion or get there.
Addicts have a lot to teach non-addicts or people that have other addiction problems.
Yeah.
If more people would apply some of the principles that addicts learn to apply to their life, you know, the world would be a much better place. There'd be less war. There'd be more civil discourse and more willingness to learn from each other, more humility, more just less self-centeredness. You know, the steps represent an antidote. Each one of those steps is an antidote to narcissism. And you know, we have a pandemic of COVID. Well, we also have a pandemic of narcissism. You know, there's a pandemic of addiction, and it's not just drug addiction.
Well, and 12 steps is not about being drug and alcohol free. It's about healthy living, right? I mean, it's like,
that's right.
Because it's not like these things only apply to people in addiction. They're primarily only used in those environments, in those, you know, but those are the tenets. The 12 steps are applicable to everybody.
That's right.
I mean, if we hurt somebody, we should make amends, right?
Right.
You know, or if we, you know, any of those, getting rid of our resentments and those types of things, those are all very relatable things across, because we tend to cope in maladaptive ways. And, you know, there's a lot to that. So, and
the 12 steps weren't necessarily invented. They were rediscovered. These are principles that were rediscovered by desperate alcoholics.
Sure.
In the 1930s, and they wrote them in that form.
Right.
And so
this is what's working. I'm gonna.
Right.
Yeah. I feel like a really awesome discussion. I don't think everybody knows what, you know, different viewpoints, different experiences related to such a sensitive topic like addiction, and hearing these, the story of AA, hearing just kind of your thoughts and views of healing and treatment. I'm hopeful that whoever listens to it kind of gets something out of this to kind of just help someone find recovery, find healing, find healthy living.
That's right.
We're going to have a lot of healing. So thank you for spending the time with me.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah.